Well, good afternoon, everyone, or early good evening. Thank you for attending this afternoon, early evening. I'm Linda Goff, and I'm president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And I want to welcome all of you who are from throughout the state here in New Mexico, our friends and colleagues from the Texas Jewish Historical Society, and others beyond. So then let me give a brief introduction to Justin Ferate. A number of you here this evening have heard Justin speak for us. The Catskills, the Jewish Catskills, parts 1 and 2, Jewish Harlem, etc. Many of you know him, and he graciously puts together one speaker program for us each year, and we are delighted to have you back. Justin is an urban historian. He also was the tour lead guide for the Gray Lines in New York and wrote the entrance exam for authorized Gray Line tour operators, and has received many recognitions from well-known people in New York City and in New York State. He also is very involved in the art world here in Santa Fe. I also like to refer to him as our Renaissance man. He is a walking encyclopedia in so many ways. So then, with as they say, with no further ado, let me hand it over to Justin Ferate.
Rabbi Ismar El-Bogan, who's a name you may not know, but was a revered personage in the late 19th, early 20th century, would describe Jacob Schiff in a very famous book called A Century of Jewish Life by saying Schiff's interest in Jewish matters began early, and he was always distinguished by the reverential regard he showed to Jewish scholarship and Jewish scholars. During the 40 years of his active career, there was scarcely a worthy Jewish movement in the United States in which he was not found at the forefront. He was recognized leader of American Jewry during that critical period in which Jewry in the United States attained world importance. So here is an image of the Lower East Side at the time that Jacob Schiff is coming to work with the community in many ways. So life in the tenement was not easy. It was very challenging. And these are typical tenements. Many tenement buildings were just converted houses where they crammed as many units as they could, and they didn't have restrooms, so you'd have to use the outdoor restrooms. That was very typical. A typical tenement space was 1 or 2 rooms at most, in which your entire family had to live and work. Many people worked directly out of their houses. In the schmata industry, they'd making shirt waists, or they may be making dresses, they might be making suspenders. They would make all of these things right there, and it was very close quarters. For those of you who attended the Jewish Catskills talks, realize that, remember, what we think of the Jewish Catskills started out originally as a place for Jews to go because of what they called the workers' disease or consumption, tuberculosis. And you can see how tuberculosis would spread in these very tight, confined situations. You may have as many as 9 or 10 people basically occupying 1 room. It was very hard, very challenging. The fact that the Jews would survive is the real miracle. So one of the things that Emma Lazarus realized is many of the Jews, because of those Russian rules, didn't have trades. They didn't have a practical trade. They didn't have a way, because they were not allowed to practice trades in Eastern Europe. So what she did is she leaned on Jacob Schiff's brother-in-law, Morris Loeb, and Jacob Schiff to found a group called the Hebrew Technical Institute in New York City. It was originally for young men. Later, it was for young men and women, and they would teach crafts, mechanics, and other skills that were marketable. The idea is to create programs so these people could actually make a living. The original school was located right in the heart of the Lower East Side on East Broadway. The East Broadway was the artery of the Lower Lower East Side, and right near the Educational Alliance, right near some of the major institutions. Eventually, it would end up on Stuyvesant Street in Greenwich Village, and the school would survive until 1939. The functions would be taken over by other Jewish organizations. The building is still extant, but sadly not landmarked. Now, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society is one of the major organizations Jacob Schiff worked with. HIAS would be a fusion of two other organizations. One was the Emigrant Society, one was the Immigrant Society. There we go again. But the HIAS as an individual organization, we founded in 1881. Today, it is still one of the most important refugee organizations in the world. The Southeast Asian immigrations were handled by HIAS. The Russian Jewish immigrations were handled by HIAS. They have been working with immigration for people who are being forced out of where they live, mostly due to religious reasons. Jacob Schiff would become partners with a very important woman named Lillian Wald. The two truly were partners for humanity. Here's a quotation from Lillian Wald: "The task of organizing human happiness needs the active cooperation of man and woman. It cannot be relegated to one half of the world." Lillian Wald would be the founder of one of the most important settlement houses in American history, the Henry Street Settlement, one that still exists today. But she was trained as a nurse, and therein lies the beginning of our tale. So Lillian Wald, who was a debutante in Rochester, New York, again, a very unlikely social activist, came to New York City. Her parents wanted her to get married and do all those good things. She said, "No, I want to be a nurse." She was too young when she came to New York, so she falsified her age so she could study at the Women's Medical College, and she basically had to do better than everyone else so that no one would question. One of the things she did is she volunteered to teach a class on home health care for immigrant women at the Louis Downtown Sabbath and Day School. Founded by a woman named Minnie Dessau-Louis, and was financially assisted by Temple Emmanuel, remember the Reformed German synagogue, for the express purpose of elevating working class Jewish immigrant girls and women. If you look up, it would later become Hebrew Technical School for Girls, and you may be able to read those letters intertwined on their building. It's now the Manhattan Comprehensive Night and Day School. Lillian Wald's career would have a tremendous beginning, because while she was teaching the class one day, it was very cold, wet March day, Lillian Wald was approached by a young girl who kept saying, "Mommy, baby, blood, mommy, baby, blood, mommy, baby, blood." Wald grabbed some sheets that she'd used for teaching how to make a bed, and then she followed the child to her home, and Lillian Wald walked into probably the first tenement she'd ever walked into in her life. It was a small 2-room tenement that had housed the entire family. The mother was lying there very badly in need of health care. She had just had a child, but the doctor refused to provide her any medical assistance because she could not afford to pay him. This would be what Wald would call her baptism by fire, and she dedicated herself for the remainder of her life for nursing and education and the arts to the immigrant poor of the Lower East Side. The next year, Lillian Wald and Mary Brewster would join together to found the Nurses Settlement and a group called the Visiting Nurse Services. This is an amazing organization that would transform medical treatment in the United States. She also founded, Wald would say, schools in this country must have public nurses. If you've ever gone to a nurse in your school, that's because of Lillian Wald. She would also found the Red Cross Town and Country Nurse Service. In addition, she founded the Henry Street Settlement, and then one of her African-American workers was working with her, was saying, "You know, I don't live in this neighborhood. I live in San Juan Hill, and the people in San Juan Hill can definitely use assistance." So Lillian Wald would create Lincoln House and Stillman House, which was largely a Black and Irish community of San Juan Hill. And here are the visiting nurses here. They were a somewhat, typical costume, very simple, large skirts so they can get up and down because you can see how they walk. One of the things they learned very quickly is the most efficient way to get around for buildings is to go all the way up to the top of the stairs, walk out through the roof hatch, walk out on the roof, cross over the parapet to the next building, walk down that building's roof hatch, and go down, dealing with all the people who live in that building. And they would go like a big Z, up and down, up and down, up and down. Very, very efficient, but rather amazing thing, all by young women, mostly graduates of the Seven Sisters colleges. Now, Jacob Schiff was overwhelmed by Lillian Wald. He was so impressed by her capabilities that he went out and bought her a house. He bought her what had been formerly a mansion when Lower East Side was where very wealthy people lived. And he bought the house, which she made into the home for the Henry Street Settlement. It is still their home today. There are other buildings, but that building is still owned by the settlement. And so this settlement house would transform not only the Lower East Side, but the nation. You can see here young people playing in front of the building that Jacob Schiff would purchase. Here are young girls taking a knitting class at this dining room table. Now, the dining room table is real important. That's the original dining room in the very grand mansion. You can still see the original fireplace. But here is the dining room table where Lillian Wald would entertain people such as Jane Addams, Eleanor Roosevelt, W.B. Du Bois, Jacob Riis, Theodore Roosevelt, all would come and sit at that table. W.B. Du Bois would lead the Black movement called the Niagara Movement, and the conference took place here at the Henry Street Settlement. At that meeting where the Niagara Conference took place, it would be setting the ground plans for the creation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was born right there at that table. Wald and her colleagues at Henry Street, Florence Kelly and Henry Moskowitz, were instrumental in founding the NAACP. This would be the very first location for the very first meeting of the NAACP, and the founders included Henry Moskowitz, Mary Ovington White, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and if you're from Chicago, you definitely know the name of Rabbi Emil Hirsch, one of the most famous rabbis in the country. At various times, Jacob Schiff, Julius Rosenwald, and Herbert Lehman also served not only as officers, but remember, if you're an officer, you're also a contributor. Jacob Schiff was a major contributor to a range of endeavors specifically for African Americans. He went on both sides of the fence, which is very typical of Jacob Schiff. He supported Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, which was all about training in industrial skills, but then he was also a supporter of the NAACP and the Niagara Movement of W.B. Du Bois. He was an amazing fellow. So on the left-hand side, here's the original Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. And on the right-hand side, this is Lincoln House in Hell's Kitchen and San Juan Hill. Today, if you saw the original movie of West Side Story, that was filmed where these tenements were located. They filmed them and tore down the tenements and then built Lincoln Center. So another major thing you might never have even thought of for Jacob Schiff, he was co-creator of America's first municipal playground. There were two people behind the movement. Again, our good friend Lillian Wald with another social activist, Charles Stover, who felt that the kids in the neighborhoods needed a place for physical activity. So they pushed the movement to create public parks. So if any of your children have ever played in a public park in the United States, played on the swings, played on the playground, the inspiration came from Jacob Schiff, who was the silent backer, and Lillian Wald and Charles Stover. Jacob Schiff remember the rule of Maimonides, you're not supposed to know whose name it is. So interestingly enough, he gave a fountain that was specifically requested by Lillian Wald, and if you read the inscription, it says presented to the ASPCA by F.A. Schermerhorn in 1911. Now, Schermerhorn was a well-known philanthropist, but he wasn't the one who gave the foundation, they gave the fountain. So here is the fountain there. There's the Jacob Schiff fountain. You can see it in its position. And this is the building behind it, which was this building here, which is the pavilion for the park that was designed also by Arnold Brunner. Arnold Brunner designed the fountain and the pavilion. Arnold Brunner was the favorite architect of Jacob Schiff. So you understand the connection here. Jacob Schiff has quietly contributed the building. I mean, you don't have to look too carefully, except that literally for decades after the demise of both Lillian Wald and Jacob Schiff, no one knew fully the extent of the financial support that Jacob Schiff gave, because neither one of them would tell, but it's in the paperwork, so we now know. Now, right by Seward Park, where that first public playground was, the Educational Alliance, which was founded as a partnership between Jewish Harlem's Awelar Free Library, which was a Jewish library named for Grace Awelar, a Sephardic Jew from England, whose writings are still in print. You can type in Grace Awelar in your Amazon thing, and you'll find books by her still available. It was one of the important free libraries that would eventually become part of the New York Public Library. Also, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, now called the 92nd Street Y, for which Jacob Schiff not only helped fund the organization, he gave them the building, and the building is on the corner of 92nd and Lexington, and the Hebrew Institute. All three of these organizations were Jacob Schiff organizations, and then we got them to join together to create this settlement house called the Educational Alliance. So the function of the settlement house was to help these Eastern European Jews. So he got all of his good friends. So Jacob Schiff got Isidor Strauss, Samuel Greenbaum, Meyer Isaacs, Morris Loeb, Edwin Seligman to join together. They raised $125,000, which in today's money is about $4 million, to buy the land and then build the famous building, which is still there today. Schiff was the vice president. And so guess who got the contract for the building? Arnold Brunner. And then Schiff was the supervisor of building the building. The building is still renowned, and it taught subjects such as English, American history, civics, a word that seems to have disappeared from public schools today, stenography, and cooking. And in 1903, the Educational Theater was founded, and one of the performances was attended by Mark Twain, who was so impressed that he joined on the board of advisor. It was at the Educational Alliance that Eddie Cantor made his first stage debut in 1905. But it was much more than that. They were famous for training artists. And if you look to the artists of the mid-20th century, look at how many of them studied at the Educational Gross. Just a handful of them include Chaim Gross, Philip Evergood, Ben Shahn, Leonard Baskin, both brothers, Moses and Isaac Sawyer, Joe Davison, Dina Melikoff, Peter Bloom, and Abraham Walkowitz. In addition, the famous artist and sculptor Louise Nevelson taught classes there. Now, if you look here, there's a sculpture by Louise, I'm sorry, my cursors are working, Louise Nevelson. This is by Joe Davison. These are two paintings by the Sawyers. And here is, of course, the actual Educational Alliance, which is still very active today. Now, for those who attended the Jewish Catskills talk, you know that the Catskills were originally meant to be both for consumption and for a place for Jewish farmers. And Baron de Hirsch would establish Jewish farms. Jacob Schiff was on the board. And so one of the things they do is they use the Alliance for showing off their Harvest Festival. So here's a photograph of the Harvest Festival from the Jewish Catskills of Sullivan County. One of Jacob Schiff's favorite institutions, favorite benefactions, was the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. I want to start up front. My father grew up in an orphanage. 94% at the smallest number of American orphanage children in American orphanages had living parents. Very few orphanages had children who were truly orphaned by both parents. The problem was people couldn't afford to take care of their children, so they would send them to an orphanage. Now, the orphanage would be established in 1858 because an because in 1858, there was a scandalous kidnapping of a Jewish boy, 6 years old, Edgardo Mortara, who was basically kidnapped by the Papal States. One of the caretakers was a Gentile nurse who said, a Gentile housekeeper who said, oh, Edgardo was very sick, so I baptized him. And the Roman Catholic Church says, once he's baptized, he's a Catholic. And so Edgardo Mortara was never allowed to go home to his parents and was not raised as a Jew. In fact, he was religiously raised as a Catholic under the personal guidance of Pope Pius IX, who absolutely refused to let his parents ever see him. It was not till many years later that Edgardo Mortara actually saw his parents. Now, and he eventually became a priest. Today, this institution, funded and constructed by and maintained to a great extent by Jacob Schiff, is now the site of the Jacob Schiff Playground. But as I said, a lot of children didn't have had parents, but no place to go. And the numbers started overwhelming the orphanage. So they created a secondary institution called the Sheltering Guardian Society in 1910. Again, this is in Jewish Harlem at 136 and Amsterdam Avenue. Eventually, this institution would house almost 800 kids. So interestingly enough, the society was founded intentionally with a woman president and an all-woman board. They wanted to make sure, it's very important that the organization have the influence of the women of the Jewish community. The need still expanded, so they needed a place for infants. There were so many infants that needed care, so they actually would build the Hebrew Infant Asylum, later renamed the Home for Hebrew Infants, which would actually survive until 1942. This is the building that Jacob Schiff built. You can see his benefactors. And the thing to understand that he's on the boards, he's actually making decisions, helping keep the finances in order, because he's a businessman. So it's all well and good to have good thoughts, but it's not well and good to have poorly financially managed good thoughts. So that was one of the main roles that he played. One of the things he did is he built the Hawthorne Cedar Knoll School in Westchester County, specifically because one of the problems of the Lower East Side was there were these juvenile delinquents. In a Jewish community, a juvenile delinquent, what a horrifying thought. And so rather than simply complain and moan about it, he created this program, which was the kids were basically sent off by the courts of New York City, Nassau, and Westchester County, but rather than being sent to a Gentile juvenile situation, they would go to a Jewish environment. The facilities no longer are used for that function. It basically stopped functioning in the 1940s. So Jacob Schiff continued to fight anti-Semitism throughout his life. And here is a quote unquote cartoon called The Stranger at Our Gate. This is from the 1890s. And you can see they figure here a fellow who is with this hooked nose and his skull cap and his beard is decidedly a Jewish stereotype. If you can read it, you can see he's carrying all sorts of things known as the baggage he's carrying, or disease, poverty, anarchy, intemperance, Sabbath desecration, and superstition. And notice our good friend Uncle Sam with the capital of the United States behind him. Uncle Sam is holding his nose, and the line is, the immigrant says, "Can I come in?" And Uncle Sam says, "I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out." Well, that was the issue. Jacob Schiff fought the laws that were constantly being raised. If you'd seen, the anti-voting laws have been just proliferating lately. Similar things were happening with immigration in this country. And Jacob Schiff made it his mission to deal with every president that he had throughout his lifetime, his adult lifetime. So he dealt with Presidents Cleveland, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft, mano a mano, hand in hand, man to man, person to person. And he also lobbied with the Congress. He was constantly meeting to ensure that laws working against the immigration of Russian Jews would not happen. He was successful. the first major laws against Jews would not happen until 4 years after the death of Jacob Schiff. So throughout his career, Jacob Schiff absolutely said, my money is not going to go to help anyone in Russia because Russian Empire has done bad things to the Jewish people. And he did change from that after 1917, after the Russian Revolution, because he believed that the oppression of Jews would end. Sadly, he was not correct. But in any case, here's something he didn't finance, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And if you visit the New York Stock Exchange today, you can see in the boardroom this very monument. It's very elegant. It's got a beautiful jasper base. Jasper is a kind of jade. And you can see this beautiful urn sculpted by Karl Fabergé, the court jeweler to the Russian imperial court. Very famous today. Many people know about the Fabergé Easter eggs, which were often little tricky devices, but always bejeweled, but he did lots of other things. J.P. Morgan and Company underwrote the mortgage for building the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Jacob Schiff said, look, I can make a lot of money, but I'm not going to help the Tsar. So this was given in 1904 by the Tsar of Russia to the New York Stock Exchange, AKA J.P. Morgan. Meanwhile, in 1904, something else was going on. Jacob Schiff realized that Russia was on an expansionist mode. They wanted to be even bigger. They wanted to get more ports. Does this sound familiar? And so what happened is that they started making incursions into China with a hope that they would eventually take over Japan and China and Manchuria. So this is the height of yellow peril. This is a cartoon from the time with all the rulers of Europe lying in bed, and you can see the celestial empire. That's what it says in French, and you see these thousands of people coming from China to take over the world. And so in the 1890s, with the rise of yellow peril, and it happened in the United States too, Emperor Nicholas II received a note from his cousin, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, saying that Holy Russia has been chosen by God as the savior of the entire white race from the yellow peril. So the Kaiser repeatedly told his cousin that Russia was entitled to annex all of Korea, Manchuria, and northern China up to Beijing. Now you must understand, Japan is right next door. And so they approached Jacob Schiff, and Jacob Schiff makes an interesting arrangement. He personally extends them $200 million. That's the equivalent of $5.6 billion in 2019. It's probably more today. I wasn't able to get more current numbers. In loans to the Empire of Japan. Now, the Empire of Japan is considered, backstreet, nothing important, inconsequential. But when Jacob Schiff funded them this money, he said, I have only one stipulation: you must win the war. Now, it was basically a sea war. And so the Russian war, this Russo-Japanese War from 1905 to 1905 would be the war that would be basically financed by Jacob Schiff. This is very important because this is in the news today. This is very important. And one of the things that happened is that if you can look here, you'll see the Empire of Japan. Here is Vladivostok. And I want you to notice what happens at Vladivostok. This is a railroad built by J.P. Morgan going through Manchuria all the way to the town of Port Arthur in China. So here is the Russian government making what is obviously an attempt at taking over the property through the railroad. They had a legal arrangement, and the Russians, needless to say, failed to fulfill it. And so Japan felt compelled to challenge the Russians. So that is the rise of war. The amazing thing, they won. But why did Jacob Schiff do this? Because of the Kishnev massacre, the Kishnev pogrom. This was a tremendous pogrom, and because of the pogrom, the Russian pogrom against the Jews, because of the Orthodox Church, because of the Tsar, the Kishnev Pogrom in 1903 really said, Schiff said, we got to go beat those Russians. So in 1904, he would lend this money to the Japanese government. The Kishnev massacre was considered to be so important that one historian described it as nothing less than a prototype for the Holocaust itself. In 3 days of violence, 49 Jews were killed, 600 raped or wounded, and 1,500 Jewish-owned houses and stores and synagogues were ransacked and destroyed. This would inspire a man named Theodor Herzl to create the concept he called the Uganda scheme, which would move all the Jews to Uganda. That didn't happen. That would be the prelude to moving the Jews to Palestine. But this was that pogrom. So you can see how tremendous that impact that pogrom had. And because Japan won the war, King Edward VII, among many rulers in Europe, said, I got to know this guy. And so Jacob Schiff traveled to Europe and was invited for a private audience with Edward VII. And guess what he used the audience for? Jacob Schiff was immediately saying, King Edward, could you possibly arrange for Russian Jews to move to England? So, and again, he was always fighting for the Eastern European Jew. In 1905, because of the fact that the Japanese won, of course, the Japanese were not supposed to win. The first Russian Revolution took place. You'll sometimes read about this in today's papers, not as frequently. It's not as known as the 1917 revolution, but the 1905 was a prelude revolution. And Tsar Nicholas said, okay, we're going to shift from an autocracy to a constitutional monarchy. Not really, but at least he gave it a good face. Not good enough, because by 1917, the Russian Empire went out of existence. So this is from today's newscast, Wednesday, March 30th, 2022. A headline stated, strategists are asking whether the invasion of Ukraine could backfire spectacularly on Putin, leaving him vulnerable to an uprising at home as living standards fall or a coup led from within the elite. It appears that history might be repeating itself. Now, in response to this, Jacob Schiff would join with his friends to create something called the National Committee for the Relief of Sufferers by Jewish Massacres. I apologize for all these names. They're like incredibly long names. They want to make sure they're very specific about their titles. So in any case, they focus a lot on the needs of the survivors of the pogroms, both in Russia and once they came to the United States, taking care of their needs in the United States. Remember, Jews have historically been noted for taking care of Jews. One of the first things when the Jews came to the island of Manhattan was that Peter Stuyvesant said they can never be on the public dole, and the Jews said, it's not an issue, we never do that. So in any case, the Jews were supporting these survivors, and many of the survivors were the tremendous number of children who were orphaned by the pogroms. These records are available at the Center for Jewish History, and some of them are actually on the internet. So if this is something you'd like to pursue, go ahead and pursue those by doing some Google searching. Now, in 1906, 3 years after the other pogrom, there was another major pogrom. Most pogroms, as I said, occurred on Christian holidays. So you can see here all of the people fighting. They're having a religious, they're carrying a religious procession, that they're taking the religious objects and actually using them as battering rams. It sounds like a certain takeover of the United States Capitol. But this is the cover of a very important Italian journal called La Domenica del Corriere, or the Sunday Courier. Here are a few images. I'm not going to linger on this because they're just horrible to look at. But the town of Bialystok would have a tremendous pogrom that took place at the Feast of Corpus Christi, which was a feast for both the Roman Catholics and the Russian Orthodox. So the Christians came from both directions. In addition, they were supported by the Black Hundreds, which an ultra-nationalist group supported by the Tsar. think of them as the Proud Boys of Russia. About 80 people were wounded, 169 houses and shops were destroyed, among them the largest stores in the city of Bialystok. This would be one of just countless other pogroms. So in 1906, 81 Jewish Americans met at the Hotel Savoy to create a program called the American Jewish Committee. This is the beginning of alphabet soup, which many Jewish organizations are accused of playing the game of alphabet soup. So the AJC was founded. This was specifically created to prevent infringement of the civil and religious rights of Jews and to alleviate the consequences of persecution. In the early years of organization included Louis Marshall, the financier Jacob Schiff, who we know very well, Judge Meyer Sulzberger, the very famous scholar Cyrus Adler, and other well-to-known and politically connected Jews. But it didn't stop there, because on August 31st of 1914, Jacob Schiff received a cable from Henry Morgan, the senior, who was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is where Palestine is located. He said, we need help, and Jacob Schiff personally gave money that would in today's money be equivalent to over $1.5 million. Here is the original cable on the left-hand side. I printed it out so you can read it. Jacob Schiff, New York, August 31st, 1914, Palestinian Jews facing terrible crisis. Belligerent countries stopping their assistance, meaning those countries, because of World War I, are not sending money to the Jews in Palestine. Serious destruction threatens the colonies. $50,000 needed immediately by responsible committee. Dr. Ruppin, chairman, to establish loan institute and support families whose breadwinners have entered the armies. Conditions certainly justify American help. Will you undertake matters? So, and immediately Jacob Schiff got all of his friends from the AJC to join together to create another alphabet organization, the JDC, the Joint Distribution Company, which began with that $50,000 donation of Jacob Schiff. And any of you who've ever been at a Jewish board meeting know the rule is you basically close the doors and say, this is how much money we're raising, and we're not letting you go until we raise the money. Jacob Schiff was very good at getting his friends to join in his philanthropies. And again, 50,000 be roughly $1.5 million in today's money. The joint distribution was incredibly important. Between 1918 and 1921, there were over 1,000 anti-Jewish pogroms documented in 500 different locales located throughout what is now the Ukraine. So the country that is under siege right now, there are over 1,000 anti-Jewish pogroms. Many historians would agree that the numbers of death were well over 100,000 individuals. About 2/3 of all the houses and over half of all the Jewish businesses were either looted or destroyed. The pogroms traumatized the affected communities for at least a generation or longer. The American Joint Committee still continues today, and in 2014, it spent over $369 million to aid poor and threatened Jews overseas, helping Jews in Israel and Russia and the former Soviet republics, and in the Russian invasion, the American Jewish Joint Distribution was active with more than 1,000 locations across the Ukraine, with providing a lifeline for an estimated 40,000 Jewish elderly and 2,500 poor Jewish children. So the energies were high. Schiff felt something else has to happen. He works with Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who has this farm organization, which, as I said, is what created the Jewish Catskill. He's bringing people around the country, but Schiff is impatient. He doesn't feel that enough is happening. So essentially, based on that, he realized these people got to get out of Europe. They're going to die. So he wants to bring them to the United States. He he decides that the best alternative, rather than the crowded Lower East Side community, which is tremendously impoverished with not that many job opportunities available, to take people elsewhere in the United States. So he goes to the city of Galveston in Texas, which is a major port on the Gulf of Mexico, and he would bring people to Galveston. And this would be single-handedly paid for by Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff, as an individual, paid for the entire Galveston movement, the Ellis Island of the West. So in almost 8 years, nearly 10,000 Jewish immigrants came through the port city of Galveston. This is roughly 1/3 of the number of immigrants to Palestine at the same time. Schiff provided nearly $500,000 in today's money. That's over $13.5 million of his personal fortune to do this. He used a rather unlikely thing. As I remember, Schiff often crossed fences in ways that did. He was joined with Israel Zangwill. Israel Zangwill, we'll talk about in a minute, who had an organization called the Jewish Territorial Organization, ITO, I-T-O, because one doesn't have a J, who coordinated the efforts from Europe. So Schiff in New York coordinates with Zangwill in Europe to bring people to Texas. So what do you do in Texas? You have a rabbi named, very influential, very engaging rabbi. A rabbi is very charismatic, Rabbi Henry Cohen, who provide a humanitarian face to the movement in Texas, bringing the ships to the Galveston docks. And from there, the immigrants would then go to different Jewish communities throughout the Midwest, the West, and through the South. Very few Jews actually remained in the town of Galveston. Israel Zangwill is the man who, as I said, worked closely with Theodor Herzl, and he would invent the phrase that you've probably used yourself, the melting pot. It was a phrase created by Zangwill. He wrote a very popular Broadway show and a show in England called The Melting Pot. There's the program cover on the right-hand side, and the idea of creating a homeland. Now, originally, Zangwill wanted a homeland in Uganda, but that one didn't work. But when he realized Schiff was saying, I need help and I have the money to do it, Zangwill said, it's a deal. So Zangwill handled the European side. He would have people meet in the Ukraine. He would set agents out who would deal with people and explain what the possibilities were. And then Zangwill would then make sure they got to Bremen, Germany, and then to the United States. This is a very rare piece of material. This is a program that was actually, this is one of probably 3 copies in the world, handed to the potential immigrant to Texas. And surprisingly, they're very honest. One of my favorite lines, it says, except for its southern section, the climate in Texas is good for your health, especially in the winter months. So Galveston Movement was a movement that generated great enthusiasm. There were wonderful articles. Here is a newspaper article called Jerusalem by Way of American Farms. Galveston was chosen for very practical reasons. One of the largest cities in Texas, near direct railroads, or could make connections for grain and cattle. You could travel to Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis. You could go around the country by way of the railroad. That way you could distribute the immigrants. They arranged with different synagogues, different B'nai B'rith groups throughout, so that the Jews would have Jews when they came to. It didn't always work out that way. Many of the Jews actually said, I'm not happy with this, I'm going somewhere else. We'll talk about that in just 1 minute. Very importantly, these people did join together, and the program lasted for about 8 years. Here are 2 success stories. Haskell Herlick Dry Goods in Hamilton, Texas. And here's a Jewish cattle rancher, Robert Lazar Miller, with his grandson. This photograph is from 1932 at the Denver Stockyards. Not exactly what you can think of as a typical cowhand, but it shows that the Jews really did take to the New World. American Jews in the West became pioneers, frontiermen, merchants, miners, ranchers, gunfighters, doctors, lawyers, and some of them even showed up in the Wild West shows. Jews were mayors and sheriffs in San Francisco to Deadwood, South Dakota, where their names rest in cemeteries with names like Hebrew Hill. And Jews were elected, very importantly, as state governors in Western states such as Idaho and Utah before there was ever a Jew elected as a state governor in any of the East Coast cities. It's one of my favorite photographs of my Jewish cowboy here on the left-hand side. So the story would be told in a Broadway show, an off-Broadway show, and an off-Broadway musical called The Immigrant by Mark Herlick. We saw his family's store earlier. The family, his great-grandfather moved to Texas, realized he didn't like where he was staying, and then he showed up in a town. This is a wonderful story. Showed up in a town on market day and said, "This is the place I got to be." And then he realized later that it was only busy on market day, but he made it. And that would become a famous show that some of you may have seen called The Immigrant, that would later be made into a musical. So we're going to end with just a few of the other philanthropic endeavors of Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff the Jewish Theological Cemetery was virtually defunct. It was no longer operating. So Jacob Schiff realized that the Orthodox Jews coming from Eastern Europe weren't happy with Reform Judaism. So what he said, he pushed, along with his friends, the idea of a new conservative Judaism. And so for that, they needed an important person and they needed an important building. So Jacob Schiff hired, guess who? Arnold Brunner to design the Jewish Theological Seminary building in Jewish Harlem, which at one time was the third largest Jewish community on the planet Earth. Solomon Schechter was most famous for having sorted and distributed the documents from the Cairo Geniza. He was one of the most revered scholars in Cambridge University, and he was wooed to the United States to become the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And a totally useless bit of trivia, but one of my favorite little things, in Mount Hebron Cemetery in Flushing, Queens, there is a cemetery for the Jewish Actors Guild, and directly where Molly Picon is interred, Nellie Picon is buried next to her beloved husband, Yankla, and directly across the road is the gravesite of Solomon Schechter. Now, Solomon Schechter will be heading the JTS. He essentially founded American conservative Judaism. He invented it. It was an amazing thing. But Schiff will go in every direction. His point was Jews, no matter how you cut it. So he would also fund Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. The HUC, people often say, why Cincinnati? Well, that's because there are so many Reformed German Jews living in Cincinnati. So Jacob Schiff, again, would contribute $25,000, again, a considerably larger amount for today, for the new buildings, and he would say Arnold Brunner has to be your architect. So Arnold Brunner would design the very first building for HUC. HUC now has several campuses. Schiff would also fund the Orthodox seminary. So here's one man funding 3 different kinds of Jewish seminaries. He would fund yeshiva. Yeshiva started on the Lower East Side as Yeshiva Etz Chaim, which would join with the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. They would join together in a building that Schiff would build. There's the building you see right there. Then the yeshiva, after Schiff's death, would move up to Washington Heights. Both institutions are very thriving, very active. Yeshiva University and the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary for Orthodox rabbinic training. Now, in addition, knowing that Harlem is the 3rd largest Jewish community in the world, Jacob Schiff subsidized the uptown Talmud Torah. But you can see how his opinions are going. Here's an Orthodox Jew saying, you've got an Orthodox school, but I want the boys and girls to be in the same classroom so they're getting the same education. So it was very much ahead of his time when it came to women and women's rights. One of the other things he created was the Jewish Chautauqua Society. If you know the Chautauqua, it was started originally as a Protestant religious group in Chautauqua, New York. But what they would do is hold classes and camp meetings and all of those things. And it became a major educational endeavor. It was decided by Reverend Berkowitz in Philadelphia, this would be a great idea for Jews too. And so Jacob Schiff funded the Chautauqua Society for Jews. Here is their seal on the right-hand side, and it would survive until 2015, at which point it would become part of the Union for Reform Judaism. And speaking of helping people, Jacob Schiff would be a major innovator because he would found the Hebrew Free Loan Society. This organization still operates today. Based on the rules of Maimonides, there is no interest. And so loans are given out, small interest-free loans are paid back in weekly installments by the people. And right now it provides more than $10 million in interest-free loans on an annual basis, and their loss rate is less than 1%. It's one of those things that will be so inspirational that you will find other Hebrew free loan societies in other cities in the United States. As Maimonides said, a loan is better than charity because it helps one help oneself. So in tribute, 15 years after Jacob Schiff's death, this tribute was given at a concert. Jacob Schiff was honored by Julius Dukos, the president of the Hebrew Free Loan Society. He said Jacob Schiff holds a unique place in the life of the Jew and American people. The Jewish people had in him an intelligent, prudent, and safe counselor, a zealous promoter of measures for the comfort and improvement of his fellow beings. His sympathy for human suffering will make his memory honored and cherished by all those who knew him and all those who came after him. The greatest benefactor this society has ever had was Jacob H. Schiff. In addition, Jacob Schiff founded Technion, that famous school in Israel, which now has a branch in New York City on Roosevelt Island with the connection of Cornell University. This is one of the major schools for engineering and technical sciences, one of the few universities in the world where a student can take a class to learn how to build and launch satellites, an amazingly innovative institution. Harvard did not have any institution for the excavation and the assessment of antiquities. Now, the problem was culturally antiquities in terms of many American archaeologists were Babylonian, but Jacob Schiff said, I want Israel. So he built the Semitic Museum in Harvard. This is the building. It's now called the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. And then he said, I will fund an archaeological dig. And actually he did several digs in Israel. And so he went back to what was then Palestine, and they did the Palestinian excavation. So here's a photograph of the archaeologist, and he filled the building that he built with the materials that were excavated. Now, in addition, there's a woman whose history has always been overlooked, an amazing woman, Annie Nathan Meyer, who was taking classes at Columbia University. As a woman, she had simply a list of things she was supposed to study and a test at the end. She never entered a classroom because women were not permitted to enter classrooms at Columbia University. Now, Annie Nathan Meyer was Jewish, but granted, so she went to this Episcopalian school, but nonetheless, they did allow some Jews, but they weren't really very accommodating. And Annie Nathan Meyer wrote a 2,500 word article for The Nation saying why there should be a female version of Columbia University. She basically found the funders to fund it, and one of the funders was Jacob Schiff, who would build this building right here. Jacob Schiff would build the building and stipulate that it must be used by the young women, but that it could not be used for any particular religious group, which meant that the Episcopalians, who would have normally had religious services in the building, could not. When they built the building, of course, they didn't call it Schiff Hall because they'd named all the other buildings for the people who donated. Instead, they called it students' hall. And then they then went around and made a regulation that was in operation for many years that you could never name a building at Barnard for a Jewish donor. That rule has now blessedly been dropped, but the building was renamed for Frederick Barnard, who never saw the school, never had anything to do with the school, but had formerly been a president of Columbia University. I'm going to move quickly, so excuse me if I cut things short, but the Jewish Publication Society was founded by Jacob Schiff. Amazing. It's an organization that's still very vital today. Jacob Schiff was very interested in literature, and he contributed to the creation of this organization. It's not to say that other people didn't, but he was the major contributor. And one of their first major people would be, of course, Henrietta Soule, who was such a brilliant woman. She leaned on JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, and said to Solomon Schechter, I want to go to school at JTS. He said, but you're a woman. She said, I still want to go to school. So the agreement was that she could study at Jewish Theological Seminary, but would not receive shmicha and would not become a rabbi. And so she did. She completed the entire program, and as you can imagine, did better than most of the other students in the program. She would work with this program for many, many years, and then for 23 years, and then she would invent a wonderful program that many of you already know, Hadassah. Later, Zold would help Jacob Schiff with the Jewish Encyclopedia, which we'll talk about in a minute, but then another noted head for the Jewish Publication Society would be Chaim Potok, who held the position at JPS for 35 years. Here is the Jewish Encyclopedia. This was created between 1901 and 1906, and it is still considered today to be one of the greatest Jewish scientific works. It's an amazing, amazing endeavor. So as long as you're dealing with up to 1906, this is a tremendous, tremendous resource. Even better, this is on the internet. I actually use the Jewish Encyclopedia for research for this talk. So Jacob Schiff also created the first English Tanakh. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but remember, Jews are reading Christian Bibles if they couldn't read Hebrew. Christian Bibles are filled with Christian interpretations. And what they would do is they would intentionally twist the language to predict the coming of Jesus as a savior. Well, needless to say, that wasn't a big thing for Jews. And so what Schiff insisted was that they used biblical scholarship, and it still is considered one of the best translations of the Tanakh ever published. The Hebraic section of the Library of Congress is one of the world's foremost collections of Hebrew and Yiddish materials, many of which were given by Jacob Schiff. He would actually buy up whole collections and give them. One of the great beloved collections, Doroh, Jewish division of the New York Public Library, Doroh meaning generation. You probably know the phrase Lador Vedor, the idea from generation to generation. And the collections were given when the library was first created, and then Schiff continued to give for the remainder of his life. Schiff also helped found the Bronx Zoo, helped the Hewitt sisters with their Cooper Union Museum, helped be a major benefactor of the American Red Cross. He worked with Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, for expeditions to China, which would found the very critical collections that are used by the Museum of Natural History, Columbia University, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When Jacob Schiff was 70, his grandchildren were all given containers of 70 golden coins for those less fortunate than ourselves. So the children were told, you must give these to others who need it more than you. In 1917, Jacob Schiff distributed $700,000 among various charitable organizations. And he died at the age of 73 in his home on Fifth Avenue. An estimated 1,500 people squeezed into that synagogue we saw on 43rd Street and Fifth Avenue. the New York Times reported that thousands of Jews flocked from the east side and other parts of the city to the Schiff residence at 78th and 5th Avenue and to Temple Emmanuel. Jewish shops and businesses throughout the city were closed. And here is his funeral notice. Jacob Schiff Parkway, the entrance to the Williamsburg Bridge, would be named after Jacob Schiff. But there's one unexpected blessing, and this will be the final saga of tonight's talk. Jews came to Japan in the 1860s when Japan opened to trade. These were merchants, so there was a group of Jewish businessmen in Kobe and then other cities such as Yokohama and Nagasaki. But then when trade with Russia declined because of the Russo-Japanese War and the earthquake in Yokohama drove people away, people centered on Kobe. So by the time of World War II, there were about 1,000 Jews living in Kobe with about 50 families. They're mostly Sephardim from Iraq and Iran and Ashkenazim originally from Russia. The Jewish community got to be known as, believe it or not, JewCom, which was its cable address, meaning Jewish community. That name was not meant in any way to be negative, and the Japanese government was actually very positive with the Jewish community. On the left-hand side, you can see the synagogue in Kobe. Jacob Schiff, because he had contributed so much money to helping Japan during the Russo-Japanese War, he was revered. Now, Jacob Schiff is deceased, but well after his death, people are saying, Jacob Schiff was good to us. We must be good to the Jews. And so the Jews were well treated. And at the early stages of World War II, suddenly Kobe was flooded with Jewish refugees coming from Europe and Japan to Japan in an incredible pace. They're from Germany, Austria, and Poland. And they would leave from Vladivostok and enter into Kobe. And the small community of about 1,000 people would entertain almost 5,000 Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. The community would get the aid of Americans who would help. And then as the Pearl Harbor approached, the Japanese had to make a decision. So they took all the Jews from Kobe and moved them to Shanghai, China, where there's already a Jewish community, so that the Jews would be protected during the war. And it's a very great testament to the Japanese that of the nearly 5,000 Jews who escaped to Japan for safety, only 2 died during the wartime period. So I'll end with a word, Rachmanis. Rachmanis means compassion. Gunther Hirschberg was a former rabbi of New York's Congregation Rodef Sholem. He was born in Berlin in 1920, which was the year that Jacob Schiff died. The young Hirschberg was forced to flee the Nazi regime in 1936. Years later, he recalled his childhood days in Germany as life for the Jews became ugly. We weren't allowed to forget our Jewishness, not for a moment. The anti-Semitic slurs, the bullying in the classroom, the fights, the propaganda, the discrimination. But in a very different way, the children are also not allowed to forget their ethical origins. Rabbi Hirschberg said, I remember our Jewish teacher, a Rebbe, who gave us separate religious instruction. He was small, not particularly well-kempt. He wore Hasidic garb. His German was more like Yiddish. He was the prototype of the anti-hero, but for us, he became a hero. I will never forget what this unlikely Hebrew said to us in his Yiddish-inflected German. Kinderlein, as ihr habt kein Rachmanis, for was seid ihr Jiden? Children, if you have no compassion, what makes you Jews? May his memory be a blessing. Thank you very much.
Justin, thank you so much for a wonderful program tonight. And I'm sure everyone here this evening gained so much knowledge and information that we didn't have, and maybe a little bit we did know about, but certainly learned more about. And thank you ever so much. And again, thank you and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you all very, very much.